So we want to give as much time as possible, obviously, to the speakers. I think you're going to decide, as I've been lucky enough to already chat with these folks, I think we have a real brain trust of experts in this area. And to start us off is going to be Mr. Rich Metzler, who is going to share an overview on the assessment of respiratory protective devices and the 100 years of respiratory protection in the U.S. So, Rich, take it away.
Well, thank you, and good morning. I will present 4 key lessons from the last 100 years of respiratory protection based upon the nation's experience in establishing and implementing the occupational safety and health model to protect workers. And I suggest adapting that model to optimize protection for non-traditional and public use of respirators. Next slide, please. I present 4 key lessons learned associated with 3 topics relevant to providing effective respiratory protection. Those topics are conformity assessment, respirator approval, and a national strategy. Next slide. We should start with a description of conformity assessment so that we're all on the same page when we talk about what this means. Conformity assessment is the demonstration that specified requirements for a product, process, system, person, or body are fulfilled. And there are activities that can include a supplier's declaration that they conform to specified standards. That's a first-party declaration. A certification, which is always an independent third-party declaration of conformance. And it can include activities such as sampling and testing products or components, inspection, requirements for the management of quality, requirements for the quality control, attributes of products, accreditation of the competencies for those who perform those activities, and the recognition of the accreditation program's capability. In 1996, the National Technology Transfer Advancement Act promoted economic, environmental, and social well-being, bringing technology and industrial innovation to the marketplace. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, has the responsibility to coordinate federal, state, local standards and conformity assessment. And the American National Standards Institute, a private not-for-profit organization, serves as the U.S. administrator of the private sector voluntary standards and conformity assessment system. ANSI facilitates the development of American national standards by accrediting over 240 standards development organizations thus far, such as ASTM International and National Fire Protection Association, or ISEA. Next slide. Conformity assessment activities are the vital link between standards and products. And respiratory protection device requirements are typically found in American national standards, although they're often in contracts and purchase agreements. And these include design, performance, quality assurance and control, reliability, labeling, caution limitations and restrictions of use, and user instructions. It's important to note that conformity assessment activities and the robustness of a program or the independence of that program for personal protective technologies must be driven by the risk of exposure to hazards of a non-conforming product. And the specified standards should be effective to reduce risk of exposure to safe levels. You'll hear more about respiratory risk and user requirements in the next session. Next slide, please. So lesson number 1. The National Academies has already studied conformity assessment a number of times, including that for PPE and respirators. In 1996, the National Research Council made recommendations that government agencies should retain oversight responsibility for critical regulatory and procurement standards in the area of public health, safety, environment, and national security. It also said that the assessment activities for conformance to standards is best performed by the private sector. The government should act only in an oversight capacity. In 2008, the Institute of Medicine and the NRC further made a recommendation that NIOSH should collaborate with many different organizations to conduct an assessment of the certification mechanisms needed to ensure the efficacy of all types of personal protective technologies. In 2011, it made recommendations that NPPTL should serve as in a leadership role to develop and implement a comprehensive risk-based framework for the classification and conformity assessment of PPT. NIOSH delivered. In 2018, worked within 30 public and private sector organizations, NIOSH published a conformity assessment framework. You'll hear more about that tomorrow in session 4. These 4 documents, I think, are key in guiding the NAS's panel work in this area. Next slide. Lesson 2. The U.S. conformity assessment infrastructure is now robust and can support risk-based PPE conformity assessment using private sector CA programs with centralized oversight applying the NIOSH PPE CA Framework to enhance conformity assessment program effectiveness. I'm not going to describe this underpinning system that supports the implementation of specifications and standards between suppliers and buyers. But we should be aware that the infrastructure is market-driven and decentralized. It has been shaped over the past century by major events, including 2 world wars, which were concerned about the appropriate standards and conformance for the acquisition of military equipment, and the emergence of massive industries such as the railroads, electrical power distribution, fire service and prevention, the insurance industry, and others. Global trade was another major factor. Today, there are thousands of conformity assessment programs with varying levels of activities, independence, and robustness depending upon objectives. For PPE, the system is decentralized. NIOSH, for example, approves respirators used for occupational use, DOJ body armor, NFPA fire service products, the U.S. Coast Guard on personal flotation devices, the Snell Foundation, for example, on helmets. These are just a few. NIOSH already provides oversight for respirator approvals, so there should be no technical reasons why the infrastructure could not support NIOSH to update its existing program. However, the infrastructure lacks a centralized authority to be administered for the application for non-traditional and public uses, and this should be considered by the Academies panel. Next slide. The second topic area is respiratory protective device approvals. The programs were established in the early 1900s with the first approval in 1919 by the U.S. Bureau of Mines. And in establishing a conformity assessment program, the U.S. Bureau of Mines indicated that all products should be based upon the concept of permissibility, safe for intended use. This is not just for respirators, but any mining products, explosion-proof enclosures, explosives, conveyor belts for flammability, resistance, and so on. The Bureau said that for respirators, there is a need to give adequate protection for intended use. They should be reasonably comfortable and convenient to wear. They should provide acceptable protection for a suitable period, and they should be constructed of durable materials. This approach has a significant challenge, particularly in situations where knowledge of a hazard continues to evolve or the technologies advance. Approval requirements were linked to hazard classification and uses, therefore the requirements varied for different respirator types. Next slide, please. So lesson 3, conformity assessment is necessary to safeguard personal protection, but it's not sufficient to ensure intended protection. I'm going to say that again. This is very important. Conformity assessment is necessary to safeguard personal protection, but not sufficient to ensure intended protections. Here are 4 key areas. The first is a respiratory protection program, which is vital to assure proper selection, use, and maintenance. We've known from research and national consensus organizations going back to 1938, where respiratory protection program standards were revised 7 times by different organizations in 38, in 59, 69, 80, 92, 2015, 2019. We know that it was implemented in 1971 and 1910 134 OSHA requirements, and in 1972 in NIOSH 30 CFR 11 approval requirements. A respiratory protection program is needed. We've learned our lesson. It should not be short-circuited for public protection. A second critical characteristic is a certification does not necessarily equal an approval. Private sector accredited certification organizations make independent third-party declarations of conformance to specified standards, but they do not assure the specified standards are appropriate to meet intended uses and exposures to specific hazards. Additionally, standards developers in the private sector may not adequately describe hazards or the limitations of use for those conforming products. Until these activities are integrated, a certification in the private sector does not equal an NIOSH approval. The third point is U.S. law. It puts a demand on NIOSH that when it is developing new mandatory regulations or standards for respirators, that no new mandatory regulation should reduce the protection of an existing standard. This is a challenging requirement that NIOSH has to give serious consideration to every time it develops regulations. It also has to meet the Regulatory Flexibility Act that obligates NIOSH to assess the need for the regulation, to identify alternatives, to determine if the regulation is designed to achieve the agency's objectives at the most cost-effective manner, and also facilitates the use of performance standards. How and if this is applied to conformity assessment programs for protecting the private sector must be considered. And last but not least, there's a need for a centralized conformity assessment oversight to address things like evolving hazards, technological advancements, updated requirements or standards and whether they're appropriate. How do you deal with transition periods when you move from one set of standards to a new set of standards? We refer to that as Godfather periods. We also need to look at the resolution of non-conforming or counterfeit products and CA process evaluations that they are effective. Next slide. My third and final topic is a national strategy. Non-traditional RPD users, including the public, there is no centralized recognized authority, as there are for occupational uses with OSHA and MSHA and DOE. For non-traditional uses, there's no single agency or agencies identified, but there are multiple agencies that have some type of jurisdiction, including NIOSH, the FDA, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and today, Homeland Security. Leadership nationally is not secure, not identified, and therefore there can be inconsistencies. And we've seen some with this face covering issue with regard to face coverings as being source control and how they're being implemented nationally. Next slide, please. So our fourth lesson and final lesson is that a public protection system with recognized administrative authority can integrate safety and health requirements with conformity assessment risk-based requirements to ensure PPE used by the public wearers are and remain protected. And some of the activities that this authority can oversee is the establishment and maintenance of protection requirements based upon the hazards and risks. They can investigate nonconformances and fraudulent CA declarations, help to remove nonconforming products, inform and provide the public with critical guidance, and update the processes and requirements to address newer evolving hazards, advancements in technologies, or the need for revised or new standards. Congress is going to need to act to fill this gap. And failure to do so in identifying a centralized authority could weaken protections and reduce confidence in PPE conformance declarations. My last four slides are just a summary. So the next slide, please. We're going to go through these very quickly. Lesson number one was regarding conformity assessment. The National Academies has studied this, published 3 publications, including the NIOSH publication for conformity assessment. These should be reviewed by this panel. Next slide. Lesson 2. The U.S. conformity assessment infrastructure is robust and can support risk-based PPE conformity assessment using private sector programs applying NIOSH PPE Framework with centralized oversight. And there isn't any reason, technical reason, that NIOSH couldn't use this infrastructure to support and improve its current program. And the fourth, next lesson, please. 3, respiratory protection device approval. Conformity assessment is necessary to safeguard protection, but it's not sufficient. And these 4 areas, at least these 4 areas, must be considered. And the last slide, the last lesson, but obviously not least, a national strategy is needed. A public protection system that mirrors what is done for occupational safety and health in this country could provide the necessary coordination among many organizations, including users, to ensure workers are and remain protected. And now I'm ready for the panel discussion.